Willow Creek was a quiet town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and nothing truly terrible ever seemed to happen. But one icy November morning would shatter that peace forever. The town's beloved lake, Emerald, became the stage for an unthinkable act. No one who heard the cries echoing over the frozen water could imagine the horrors taking place. And when the truth began to emerge, the entire town was left reeling. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe for more captivating stories that will leave you on the edge of your seat. The chill of the morning air bit into Alice Green's cheeks as she walked beside her father, Nathan. Her small hand fit snugly into his calloused palm, and she had to skip a step occasionally to keep up with his long strides. Alice loved mornings like this, just her and her dad, heading to the lake for one of their special outings. He had promised her they'd watch the sunrise together, just like they used to when she was younger. But something was different today. Nathan's grip was tighter than usual. His eyes darted around nervously, and he barely responded to Alice's chatter about her favorite book from school. "Daddy, are we going to skip rocks today?" Alice asked, peering up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. Nathan stopped walking, his body stiffening as he looked out at the still water of Emerald Lake. The trees surrounding them were bare, their skeletal branches scratching at the gray sky. "Not today, sweetheart," he said quietly, his voice trembling. Alice frowned but didn't push. Her father had been acting strange for weeks now, staying out late, whispering on the phone, and pacing the living room when he thought no one was watching. Her mother, Evelyn, was no help. Whenever Alice asked why her dad was upset, Evelyn would just sigh and tell her to be a good girl and stop asking questions. When they reached the edge of the lake, Nathan knelt in front of Alice. His eyes, usually warm and kind, were clouded with something she didn't recognize. "I love you, Alice," he said, brushing a strand of her dark hair behind her ear. "I love you too, Daddy," she replied, a giggle bubbling in her chest. "Why are you acting so weird?" Nathan's hands trembled as he cupped her face. He opened his mouth to speak but closed it again, his jaw tightening. Before Alice could say anything else, Nathan stood abruptly, lifting her into his arms. She squealed with laughter, thinking it was a game. "Daddy, what are you?" But then she saw the lake, the dark, icy water stretching out before them like an open mouth. "Daddy, wait!" she screamed, her small hands clawing at his shoulders. Nathan walked into the freezing water without hesitation. The cold bit through Alice's thin jacket, and she thrashed harder, her cries echoing through the trees. "Please, Daddy, stop. I don't like this game." Nathan's face was a mask of agony as he waded deeper, the water rising to his waist. Then, without a word, he let go. Alice hit the water with a splash, the cold stealing her breath. Her arms flailed as she tried to stay afloat, her small body dragged down by the weight of her soaked clothes. "Daddy, help me!" But Nathan was already backing away, his face pale as he turned and ran toward the woods. Alice's cries grew weaker as the cold sapped her strength. The world blurred, her vision darkening as she sank below the surface. And then a sound. A deep, guttural roar shattered the stillness, sending birds scattering from the trees. From the shadows of the forest, a massive figure emerged. A lion, its golden mane glinting in the dim light. The beast bounded toward the lake with a grace and power that seemed otherworldly. Alice's head broke the surface just as the lion plunged into the water, its muscular body cutting through the icy depths. Strong jaws closed gently around the back of her jacket, and she was dragged to shore. Gasping and shivering, Alice looked up at her savior in disbelief. The lion stood over her, its amber eyes piercing as it let out another earth-shaking roar. The sound carried to a group of early morning joggers on the other side of the lake, who froze in shock at the sight of the great beast. "Somebody call animal control," one of them shouted. The lion didn't move, its powerful frame shielding Alice as she sobbed into the frozen ground. Moments later, sirens wailed in the distance. By the time the authorities arrived, the lion had been tranquilized, and Alice was wrapped in a blanket, her small body trembling as she clung to the officer who carried her to safety. Her father was nowhere to be found. As news of the incident spread, the story quickly morphed into something sinister. The townspeople whispered about the lion attacking Alice, despite her protests to the contrary. "It saved me," she tried to tell them. "It didn't hurt me." But no one believed her. By evening, the lion was locked in a cage at the local animal control center, its fate uncertain. And Alice, still shivering in her damp clothes, sat alone in a hospital room, wondering why her father had left her to drown. Evelyn arrived hours later, her face pale and drawn. She hugged Alice tightly, murmuring reassurances that felt empty. But when Alice tried to tell her mother what had happened, Evelyn's expression turned cold. "Don't make up stories, Alice," she said sharply. "The police think it attacked you, and you don't want to get anyone in trouble, do you?" Alice shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "But it didn't, Daddy." "Enough," Evelyn snapped. "Your father isn't here, and we need to move on." Alice felt a lump form in her throat as her mother's words sank in. She was alone in this. No one believed her, and the one creature that had saved her life was now being called a monster. That night, as Alice lay in her hospital bed, she whispered into the darkness, "Why did you do it, Daddy?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. And somewhere, in a cold, dark cage, the lion let out a low, mournful growl. Would Alice ever find the truth? Or would the secrets her family kept tear her apart before she could? The sun rose over Willow Creek the morning after the incident, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. News of what had happened at Emerald Lake spread like wildfire. People whispered about the little girl who had been rescued by a lion. Some called it a miracle. Others thought it was nothing short of madness. But in the Green household, the tension was so thick it felt like the walls themselves might crack under the pressure. Evelyn paced the kitchen, her hands trembling as she gripped her coffee mug. The early morning light reflected off the dark circles under her eyes. She hadn't slept all night, replaying Alice's words in her mind. "Daddy did it. He threw me in the water." Those words made Evelyn's stomach churn, but not for the reasons one might think. She wasn't worried about Nathan's whereabouts or whether her daughter was telling the truth. What truly terrified her was the judgment of the town. Willow Creek thrived on gossip, and Evelyn had spent years building an image of a perfect family. Alice sat at the breakfast table, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but Evelyn hadn't said a word of comfort. Instead, she had been peppering Alice with questions all morning. "You must have misunderstood, Alice," Evelyn said finally, her voice sharp. "Your father wouldn't do something like that." Alice's lower lip trembled. "But he did, Mom. He looked at me, and he just let me go." Evelyn slammed her mug onto the counter, the sound making Alice flinch. "That's enough. People are already talking about what happened. Do you want the whole town thinking our family is broken?" Alice shook her head, the lump in her throat growing larger. She didn't understand why her mother wasn't listening. Didn't she care? "But the lion saved me." Alice tried again, but Evelyn cut her off. "Stop it. That animal nearly killed you. That's what people are saying, and you'll only make it worse if you keep insisting otherwise." Alice bit her tongue, her tiny fists clenching in frustration. Later that morning, Evelyn drove Alice to school. As they pulled up to the red brick building, Alice felt her stomach twist. She used to love school. It was her escape, a place where she could play with her friends and forget about the quiet tension that always lingered at home. But today was different. As soon as Alice stepped out of the car, the whispers began. "There she is, the lion girl. Did you hear? Her dad's missing. They think he ran off because of what he did to her." Alice's cheeks burned as she clutched her backpack tightly. She kept her head down, trying to ignore the stares and hushed voices. In the classroom, things weren't much better. During recess, Alice's best friend, Clara, approached her hesitantly. "Is it true, Alice? About the lion?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alice nodded, her eyes lighting up for the first time that day. "It saved me, Clara. It pulled me out of the water and—" "But why were you in the water?" Clara interrupted, frowning. "Did you fall?" Alice hesitated. Should she tell Clara the truth? Would Clara believe her when no one else did? My dad. Alice began, but the words caught in her throat. Before she could continue, a group of kids nearby burst into laughter. Bet she's making it all up, one boy sneered. Probably wanted attention, so she jumped in the lake herself. Alice felt tears sting her eyes as Clara turned away, her face uncertain. That evening, back at home, Alice sat at the kitchen table, pushing peas around on her plate. Evelyn was on the phone in the next room, her voice low and hurried. Alice couldn't make out the words, but she caught a name. Greg. The name made Alice's ears perk up. Greg was an old friend of Evelyn's, a lawyer who had helped the family with a property dispute years ago. Alice hadn't seen him in a long time, but the way Evelyn's tone softened when she spoke to him made Alice's skin crawl. Her thoughts were interrupted when Evelyn walked into the room, her phone still pressed to her ear. She stopped short when she saw Alice's untouched plate. "Eat your dinner, Alice," Evelyn said curtly before retreating back into the living room. Alice sighed, resting her chin in her hand. Her eyes wandered to the newspaper folded on the counter. She recognized the headline immediately. Child rescued by lion at Emerald Lake. Her heart sank as she read the article. It painted Magnus as a dangerous animal that had, miraculously, spared her life. There was no mention of her father, no mention of what really happened. Alice tore the article from the paper and stuffed it into her pocket. She didn't know what she was going to do with it, but she couldn't let the lies stand. That night, as Alice lay in bed, she stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. Why had her father done it? Where had he gone? And why was everyone so quick to blame Magnus when he was the only one who had tried to save her? She thought about the lion trapped in some cold, sterile cage. Did it know what was happening? Did it understand that everyone thought it was a monster? Alice squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push the thoughts away. But the more she tried not to think about it, the clearer the image became. Her father's face as he let her go, the freezing water closing over her head, and the golden mane of the lion as it carried her to safety. "I have to do something," Alice whispered to herself. But what could an 8-year-old girl possibly do to save a lion and uncover the truth about her father? The air in Willow Creek felt heavier in the days following the events at Emerald Lake. Alice sat by her bedroom window, watching the bare trees sway in the autumn wind. School had been unbearable. Her classmates' whispers grew louder, the stares more cutting, and Clara, her best friend, hadn't spoken to her since that awkward exchange at recess. But it wasn't the gossip that gnawed at Alice. It was the way her mother seemed to act like nothing had happened. Evelyn moved through the house with robotic precision, cleaning, answering calls, and preparing meals as if their lives hadn't been turned upside down. Alice knew better. She had seen the panic in her mother's eyes when she thought no one was watching. Evelyn was hiding something, and Alice was determined to find out what it was. That afternoon, while Evelyn was out running errands, Alice crept into her parents' bedroom. The space felt eerily quiet, as though it had been frozen in time since her father's disappearance. The smell of his cologne still lingered faintly in the air, and Alice's heart ached at the memory of the mornings he used to lift her onto his shoulders and make her laugh until her stomach hurt. She couldn't reconcile that version of her dad with the man who had let her fall into the icy water. Alice's eyes landed on the dresser. Her fingers trembled as she opened the drawers, rifling through neatly folded shirts and socks. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she had to start somewhere. Then, tucked beneath a pile of old ties, she found it. A small, locked box. Its surface was scratched and worn, as though it had been hidden away for years. Alice's heart raced as she carried the box to her room. She didn't have the key, but her father had once taught her how to open the lock on her diary using a bobby pin. She scavenged through her desk drawer, finally finding one, and set to work. After a few minutes of fiddling, the lock clicked open. Inside, she found a collection of papers, photos, and a single worn leather journal. Alice opened the journal, her eyes scanning the hurried handwriting. The entries were dated, and each one seemed to unravel a piece of her father's life that she had never known. April 12th. I don't know how much longer I can keep this from Evelyn. Donovan's threats are getting worse, and I don't have the money to pay him back. He's promised to keep quiet about the deal, but I know better. Men like him always come to collect. May 5th, Donovan came to the house today. I told Evelyn it was a salesman, but the way he looked at Alice, I need to protect her. I need to protect both of them. But how? May 20th. He gave me an ultimatum. Pay by the end of the month, or he'll take what's most precious to me. I'm out of options. Alice's hands trembled as she read the words. Donovan. The name meant nothing to her, but she could feel its weight in her father's scrawled handwriting. Who was this man? What kind of hold did he have over her dad? Flipping through the pages, Alice found a photo tucked between two entries. It was an old picture of her father with another man, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a sharp jawline and a cruel smile. On the back, a single word was written in shaky penmanship. Donovan. Alice was so engrossed in the journal that she didn't hear the front door open. Alice! Evelyn's voice echoed through the house, sharp and impatient. Alice scrambled to hide the journal and the box beneath her bed. She forced herself to sit calmly at her desk, pretending to do homework as Evelyn appeared in the doorway. What are you doing? Evelyn asked, narrowing her eyes. Math, Alice said quickly, holding up her notebook as evidence. Evelyn's gaze lingered on her daughter for a moment before she turned away. Dinner will be ready in an hour. Don't be late. As soon as Evelyn left, Alice let out a shaky breath. She needed to know more about Donovan, and there was only one person she could think of who might have answers. The next morning, Alice rode her bike to the edge of town, to a small, run-down house hidden behind a line of overgrown bushes. She knocked tentatively on the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Victor, the retired animal trainer who had been involved with Magnus, answered the door. His lined face was a mix of surprise and concern when he saw Alice standing on his porch. Alice? What are you doing here? He asked, stepping aside to let her in. I need your help, Alice said, clutching the photo of Donovan in her hand. Victor's eyes darkened when he saw the picture. Where did you get this? It was my dad's, Alice said. He wrote about this man in his journal. His name is Donovan. Do you know him? Victor sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. Donovan, I wish I didn't. He's a dangerous man, Alice. He's the reason Magnus ended up in Willow Creek. What do you mean? Alice asked, her voice trembling. Victor hesitated before sitting down, gesturing for Alice to do the same. Years ago, I worked for a program that trained animals like Magnus to help people, rescue missions, therapy, you name it. It was a good program, but it cost money. Donovan was one of the investors, and he had other ideas. He started cutting corners, pocketing money that should have gone to the program. When the truth came out, the program collapsed, and the animals, well, let's just say not all of them made it out alive. Alice's stomach churned. And my dad? How is he connected to this? Victor looked at her sadly. Donovan must have roped him in somehow. Your dad wouldn't have gotten involved with someone like Donovan unless he felt like he didn't have a choice. Alice gripped the edges of the photo tightly. She could feel tears stinging her eyes, but she blinked them back. He did have a choice. He chose to let me drown. Victor placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. I don't believe that, Alice. There's more to the story, and I'll help you find it. For the first time since the incident at the lake, Alice felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. But as she left Victor's house, clutching the photo of Donovan and her father's journal, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Would the truth about Donovan come to light? Or would his shadowy influence threaten Alice and everyone she cared about? The chilly autumn air followed Alice home from Victor's house, her mind swirling with questions. The picture of Donovan burned in her pocket, as though the man's cruel smirk could leap off the photograph and haunt her in real life. She pedaled faster, desperate to make it home before her mother realized she was gone. As she turned onto her street, she slowed. Evelyn's car was parked in the driveway, but she wasn't alone. A sleek, black sedan with tinted windows sat behind it. Alice's stomach twisted as she approached, trying to peer through the car's dark glass. Inside the house, Evelyn stood in the kitchen, Her arms folded tightly as she stared at the man sitting at their dining table. Gregory Mitchell, or Greg, as Evelyn liked to call him, looked up with his signature smile. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, more calculated than warm. He wore a tailored suit, the kind Alice had only ever seen on TV. "You look tense, Evelyn," Greg said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "You're not having second thoughts, are you?" Evelyn shook her head, her voice low and rushed. "I don't have a choice. The whispers about Nathan aren't going away. If Donovan finds out people are talking..." She trailed off, wringing her hands. Greg chuckled softly. "That's why I'm here, to make sure everything stays under control. You keep up appearances and I'll handle the rest." Evelyn hesitated, glancing toward the window. "And Alice?" "She's a child," Greg said dismissively. "Kids forget. Give it a few weeks, and this will all blow over." Evelyn bit her lip, unsure, but nodded. "Okay." Neither of them noticed Alice slip in through the back door. She crept upstairs, her heart hammering. She didn't understand everything they were saying, but one thing was clear. Greg and her mother were hiding something. That night, Alice sat in her room, turning the photo of Donovan over in her hands. Victor's words echoed in her mind. Donovan must have roped him in somehow. But what could be so terrible that her dad would risk everything? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at her door. Evelyn stepped inside, her face a mask of forced calm. "You're quiet tonight," she said, sitting on the edge of Alice's bed. "Are you okay?" Alice hesitated. She wanted to tell her mother about Victor, about the photo, about everything. But the memory of Evelyn burning the journal stopped her. "I'm fine," Alice said softly. Evelyn smiled faintly and stroked Alice's hair. "Good. Tomorrow, Greg is coming by again to talk about helping us. He's very smart, Alice. He'll make sure everything turns out okay." Alice's stomach turned. Greg wasn't here to help them. She was sure of it. The next day, Greg arrived in the afternoon, his smile as polished as ever. Alice avoided him, staying in her room and peeking through the banister as he talked with Evelyn in the living room. "I've already spoken to Donovan," Greg said, his tone casual. "He's aware of the situation, and he wants it resolved quietly." Evelyn looked uneasy. "What does he want?" Greg shrugged. "For now, nothing. But if people start asking too many questions, well, we'll have to deal with that when the time comes." Alice's hands clenched into fists. Donovan. There it was again, that name, lingering like a dark cloud over her family. She needed to know more. That evening, Alice made up her mind. She would go back to Victor's house. But this time she wasn't just looking for answers. She wanted a plan. Under the cover of night, Alice slipped out of the house. The streets were quiet, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows. Victor's house was just as she'd left it, dimly lit and surrounded by overgrown shrubs. She knocked twice before he opened the door, his face lighting up with surprise. "Alice? You're back," Victor said, stepping aside to let her in. Alice wasted no time. She pulled out the photo and the journal, placing them on the table. "I need to know everything. My dad, he wrote about Donovan. He said Donovan was threatening him. And now Greg is talking about him too. Who is this man?" Victor sighed, sitting heavily in his chair. "Donovan isn't just a man, Alice. He's a predator. He's the kind of person who sees other people as tools, things he can use and throw away when they're no longer useful." Alice's brow furrowed. "But why was my dad involved with him?" "My dad isn't like that." Victor hesitated. "Sometimes good people get pulled into bad situations. Donovan was desperate to keep his program afloat after the government cut funding. He started reaching out to people who couldn't say no. People like your dad." Alice tilted her head. "Why couldn't my dad say no?" Victor's face darkened. "Because Donovan knew exactly how to hurt him. If your dad didn't do what Donovan wanted, he would have used you and your mom to force his hand." Alice's stomach twisted. She thought of the entries in the journal, the fear in her father's words. "So, he didn't want to hurt me?" "No," Victor said firmly. "Your dad loved you, Alice. Whatever he did it because he thought he was protecting you. But Donovan doesn't leave loose ends. If your dad tried to back out, Victor didn't need to finish the sentence. The implication hung heavy in the air. Before Alice left, Victor handed her something, a small USB drive. This has footage from Magnus' training sessions. It proves he was trained to save people, not hurt them. I was going to use it to clear his name, but what? Alice asked. Victor hesitated. Greg's been working to discredit me. He's got people who'll say the footage is fake. I need someone to help me get it to the right people. Alice nodded, determination hardening her small features. I'll help. Magnus saved me. I have to save him. Victor looked at her with a mixture of pride and worry. Be careful, Alice. If Donovan or Greg find out what you're doing. Alice met his gaze. I'm not afraid. As she pedaled home, clutching the USB drive tightly, Alice felt a spark of hope. She didn't know how yet, but she was going to clear Magnus' name. And maybe, just maybe, she'd find a way to bring her father back too. But as she approached her house, her breath caught. The black sedan was parked outside again, and Greg stood on the porch, talking to Evelyn. Alice ducked behind a bush, her heart pounding. She couldn't hear their words, but Greg's sharp gestures and Evelyn's anxious nods told her everything she needed to know. They were planning something. Alice's grip on the USB drive tightened. She didn't have much time. The next morning, Alice awoke to the sound of Evelyn's sharp voice downstairs. She sat up quickly, her heart racing as she strained to hear the conversation. Evelyn was on the phone, pacing the living room. I've told you, Greg. She's just a child, Evelyn hissed. You don't need to involve her in this. There was a long pause, and then Evelyn's tone softened, almost pleading. Fine, just make sure she's safe. I won't have her dragged into your mess. Alice's stomach twisted. What mess? And why was her mother talking about her with Greg? She slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the top of the stairs. Evelyn's voice was muffled now, her words drowned out by the thumping of Alice's heart. She had to find out what was going on. After Evelyn left for the store later that morning, Alice saw her chance. She grabbed the USB drive Victor had given her and locked herself in her room. Sitting at her desk, she plugged it into her laptop, her hands trembling. The screen flickered to life, and a folder appeared, labeled simply, Magnus. Alice clicked on the first video. The grainy footage showed Magnus as a cub, his golden fur almost glowing in the sunlight. A man, Victor, much younger, stood beside him holding a whistle. He blew it softly, and Magnus leaped into action, pulling a mannequin from a pool with precise movements. Alice's eyes widened as she watched video after video. Magnus wasn't just a lion, he was a trained rescuer. Each clip showed him responding to commands, saving dummies from simulated dangers, and even comforting people in distress. But the last video was different. The timestamp was more recent, just months before the incident at Emerald Lake. Magnus was in a small cage, pacing nervously as two men argued in the background. One of them was Victor, his face drawn and weary. The other was Donovan. You're out of your depth, Victor, Donovan sneered. The program's dead. Let it go. Victor shook his head. This isn't about the program. Magnus can still help people. You know that? Donovan laughed coldly. Magnus is an asset, nothing more. And assets that don't pay off? They get scrapped. Alice's hands clenched into fists. How could anyone talk about Magnus that way? That afternoon, Alice sat in the backyard, her thoughts spinning. She had to do something with the footage, but who would believe her? Evelyn clearly wouldn't, and Greg. He was part of the problem. A voice interrupted her thoughts. Hey, Alice, Clara said, peeking over the fence. Alice's heart sank. She hadn't spoken to Clara since the incident at the lake. She wasn't sure if Clara believed the rumors or if she was just scared, but seeing her now brought a flood of emotions. Hi, Alice said quietly. Clara climbed over the fence, her usual confidence replaced with hesitation. I heard about what happened. Are you okay? Alice shrugged. I guess. Clara sat beside her, picking at the grass. They're saying crazy stuff at school. About your dad. About the lion. Alice looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. Magnus saved me. He's not dangerous. And my dad. He's not a bad person. He just... Clara waited, but Alice didn't finish. Maybe you could tell someone, Clara suggested. Like the police. Alice shook her head. They don't believe me. No one does. Clara hesitated before reaching into her pocket and pulling out a small notebook. You can write it down. Everything that happened. It'll be proof. Alice took the notebook, her fingers brushing against Clara's. For the first time in days, she felt a spark of hope. That evening, Alice began writing in the notebook. She poured out every detail. The lake, her father's disappearance, Magnus' bravery, and the strange things she had overheard Evelyn and Greg discussing. When she finished, her hand ached, but she felt lighter. The truth was on paper now, something solid she could hold. She hid the notebook under her mattress, right beside the USB drive. The next day, Alice decided to visit Victor again. She needed to show him the videos and figure out their next move. But as she pedaled down the quiet street, a black sedan pulled up beside her, its windows rolling down. Greg's smirking face appeared. Alice, what a surprise. Alice's stomach flipped. She tried to keep pedaling, but Greg's car moved in sync with her, blocking her path. Going somewhere? He asked, his tone light but menacing. Alice stopped, gripping the handlebars tightly. I'm just going to the park. Greg raised an eyebrow. Alone? That's not very safe. Alice didn't respond, her heart pounding in her chest. Greg's smile faded. I know what you've been up to, Alice. Sneaking around, talking to Victor. It's not a good look, especially for someone whose father is missing. Tears pricked Alice's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. You don't know anything, she said, her voice shaking. Greg chuckled. Oh, I know plenty, and so does Donovan. He's not happy, Alice. Not happy at all. With that, he drove off, leaving Alice frozen in place. When she finally reached Victor's house, she told him everything. Greg knows, she said, her voice trembling. He knows about the videos. And he said Donovan isn't happy. Victor's face darkened. Donovan isn't just unhappy, Alice. He's dangerous. If he thinks you're a threat. Alice swallowed hard. What do we do? Victor placed a hand on her shoulder. We keep going. We find someone who will listen. Someone who can expose Donovan for who he really is. As Alice pedaled home that evening, her thoughts raced. Victor was right, they had to keep going. But as she turned onto her street, her heart sank. The black sedan was parked in front of her house again. And this time, Donovan was standing on the porch, his sharp features illuminated by the porch light. Alice ducked behind a tree, her breath catching in her throat. She watched as Donovan spoke to Evelyn, his gestures sharp and threatening. What was he saying? Alice's grip tightened on her handlebars. Whatever it was, she had to find out. Would Donovan's threats silence Evelyn for good? Or would Alice uncover the truth before it was too late? The sight of Donovan on the porch sent a chill down Alice's spine. His presence was like a storm cloud hanging over their house, dark and suffocating. She stayed hidden behind the tree, her heart pounding as she strained to hear what he was saying to Evelyn. It's simple, Evelyn, Donovan said, his voice cold and clipped. Keep Alice out of this. She's a liability we can't afford. Evelyn's arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her expression wavering between fear and defiance. She's my daughter, Donovan. I can't control everything she does. Donovan stepped closer, towering over her. Then you'd better learn. Because if she keeps poking around, I'll have to handle it myself. Evelyn's face paled, and she nodded reluctantly. I'll talk to her. I'll make sure she doesn't cause any more trouble. You'd better, Donovan growled. He glanced around the yard, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows. Alice ducked lower, her breath catching as he paused. Good night, Evelyn, Donovan said finally, his voice dripping with false civility. He walked briskly to his black sedan and drove off, leaving Evelyn standing on the porch, her shoulders slumped. Alice waited until her mother went back inside before slipping into the backyard and quietly entering through the kitchen door. The house was eerily quiet, save for the soft murmur of the TV in the living room. Evelyn sat on the couch, staring blankly at the screen. She didn't notice Alice at first, but when she did, her expression hardened. "Where have you been?" Evelyn demanded, her voice sharper than usual. "I was out," Alice said cautiously, her gaze darting to the doorway. "Out where?" Evelyn pressed, rising from the couch. "Do you have any idea how dangerous it is right now? For all of us." Alice frowned. "Why? Because of Donovan?" The name hung in the air like a weapon. Evelyn's face crumpled, and she sank back onto the couch. "You don't understand, Alice. You're too young to understand." "Then explain it to me," Alice said, her voice rising. "Why was he here? What did he want?" Evelyn buried her face in her hands. "He wants you to stop asking questions, to stay out of things that don't concern you." "But they do concern me," Alice shot back. "He's the reason Dad's gone, isn't he? He's the reason Magnus is locked up. And now he's trying to scare you into keeping me quiet." Evelyn's shoulders shook, and for a moment, Alice thought her mother might finally tell her the truth. But when Evelyn raised her head, her expression was cold. "This conversation is over," she said firmly. "Go to your room." Alice stared at her, stunned. "You're just going to let him control you? Let him control us?" "Go to your room, Alice," Evelyn repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. Alice stormed upstairs, slamming her bedroom door behind her. She paced the small space, her mind racing. She couldn't trust her mother. Not anymore. She retrieved the notebook from under her mattress. Flipping through the pages she had filled with details about Donovan, Greg, and Magnus. It wasn't enough. She needed more evidence, something that would force the adults to listen. Her thoughts turned to the last video on the USB drive, the one where Victor argued with Donovan. If she could show that video to someone who mattered, someone outside of Willow Creek, maybe they could stop Donovan. But how would she get it to them? Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking her train of thought. It was a text from Clara. "Can we talk?" Alice hesitated. Clara had been distant ever since the incident at the lake. "Why reach out now?" "Okay. Meet me at the park," Alice replied. The park was deserted when Alice arrived, the playground eerily quiet under the pale glow of the streetlights. Clara was sitting on a swing, her hands gripping the chains tightly. Alice approached cautiously. "You wanted to talk?" Clara looked up, her eyes red and puffy. "I'm sorry, Alice, for not believing you, for not sticking up for you at school. I was scared." Alice's heart softened. She sat on the swing beside Clara. "It's okay. I get it." "No, it's not okay," Clara said, shaking her head. "You've been through so much, and I didn't know how to help." Alice hesitated before pulling the notebook from her bag. "You can help now. I've been keeping track of everything about Donovan, Greg, and Magnus. I think my dad was trying to protect me, but he got caught up in something bad." Clara flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing. This is serious, Alice. What are you going to do with it?" "I don't know," Alice admitted. "Victor gave me a video that proves Magnus isn't dangerous, but I don't know who to give it to. No one in this town believes me." Clara thought for a moment. "What about the news? There's that reporter in Silver Ridge, the one who covered that story about the animal shelter last year. Maybe she'd listen." Alice's eyes widened. "That's a great idea, but how do we get to Silver Ridge?" Clara hesitated. "It's only an hour away by bus. My brother takes it all the time. We could go tomorrow." Alice's heart raced. It was a risky plan, but it was the best one they had. "Okay," Alice said, determination hardening her voice. "We'll go tomorrow." That night, Alice packed her bag carefully, tucking the notebook and USB drive into the bottom. She barely slept, her mind buzzing with anticipation and fear. The next morning, she told Evelyn she was going to Clara's house to work on a school project. Evelyn barely glanced up from her coffee, muttering a distracted, "Be back by dinner." Alice met Clara at the bus stop, her bag slung over her shoulder. They bought tickets with the few dollars they had scrounged together and climbed aboard, their small bodies dwarfed by the worn seats. As the bus rumbled down the highway, Alice clutched her bag tightly. She didn't know what they would find in Silver Ridge, but she knew one thing for certain. This was her chance to uncover the truth and stop Donovan for good. But as the bus pulled into the station, Alice's heart sank. Standing on the platform, his sharp eyes scanning the passengers, was Greg. Alice's grip on her bag tightened as she whispered to Clara, "Stay quiet. Don't let him see us." They ducked low in their seats, their breaths shallow as the bus slowed to a stop. Would they make it to Silver Ridge, or had Greg already caught on to their plan? The bus came to a screeching halt at the Silver Ridge station, the brakes hissing like a warning. Alice and Clara crouched low in their seats, their hearts pounding in unison. From their vantage point, they could see Greg standing on the platform, scanning the passengers as if he were a hawk searching for prey. Alice clutched her bag tightly, the USB drive and notebook hidden safely inside. She whispered to Clara, "We'll wait until he turns away. Then we run for the back exit." Clara nodded, her face pale but determined. Greg adjusted his suit jacket and pulled out his phone, glancing at the screen. He seemed distracted, but Alice knew better than to underestimate him. She had seen the way he manipulated Evelyn, the way his smooth words masked his cruelty. "Now!" Alice hissed. The two girls darted toward the back door of the bus, slipping out quietly onto the far side of the platform. They kept their heads down as they wove through the crowd, dodging travelers and luggage carts. Alice risked a glance over her shoulder and froze. Greg had spotted them. "There," he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise of the station. Panic surged through Alice as she grabbed Clara's hand and pulled her toward the exit. "Run!" The girls sprinted through the station, their shoes slapping against the tiled floor. Alice's lungs burned as she dodged a woman with a stroller, her mind racing for an escape plan. Ahead, she spotted a staircase leading down to the parking garage. "This way." They barreled down the steps, their legs aching as they descended into the dimly lit garage. The sound of Greg's footsteps echoed behind them, relentless and menacing. "Over here," Clara whispered, tugging Alice toward a row of parked cars. They ducked behind a minivan, pressing their backs against the cold metal. Alice held her breath, her chest heaving as she listened for Greg. The sound of his footsteps grew louder, then stopped. "I know you're here, Alice," Greg called out, his voice smooth and taunting. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Let's talk, okay?" Alice clenched her fists, her mind racing. She didn't trust him. She couldn't trust him. Clara squeezed her arm, her eyes wide. "What do we do?" she mouthed. Alice's gaze darted around the garage. A service elevator stood at the far end, its doors slightly ajar. It was their only chance. On three, Alice whispered, "We run for the elevator." Clara nodded, her hands trembling. 1, 2, 3. The girls bolted from their hiding spot, their footsteps echoing through the garage. Greg shouted behind them, his voice growing angrier with each step. Alice reached the elevator first, slamming her hand against the button. The doors creaked open, and the girls scrambled inside. "Come on! Come on!" Alice muttered, jabbing the close button as Greg's shadow appeared at the end of the row. The doors slid shut just as Greg reached them, his fist pounding against the metal. Alice and Clara collapsed against the wall, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. They had escaped, but Alice knew it wasn't over. The elevator took them to the ground floor of the station, where they slipped out through a side door and into the bustling streets of Silver Ridge. "Where do we go now?" Clara asked, her voice shaky. Alice pulled out the notebook and flipped to the page where she had jotted down the address of the reporter Victor had mentioned. "Here," she said, showing Clara. "Her name is Rebecca Hale. She works for the Silver Ridge Gazette." Clara glanced at the address. "That's downtown. It's a long walk." "We don't have a choice," Alice said. "We can't risk taking a bus or a cab. Greg will be watching." Clara nodded, and the two girls set off, weaving through the crowded streets. By the time they reached the Gazette building, the sun was beginning to set. The towering brick structure loomed over them, its windows glowing with the golden light of the fading day. Alice hesitated at the entrance, her palms sweating. What if Rebecca didn't believe them? What if Greg got to her first? Clara nudged her gently. We've come this far, Alice. We have to try. Alice took a deep breath and pushed open the heavy glass door. The lobby was quiet. The only sound the faint clatter of keyboards from the newsroom beyond. A receptionist looked up from her desk, her expression curious. Can I help you? We need to see Rebecca Hale, Alice said, her voice steadier than she felt. The receptionist frowned. Do you have an appointment? No, but it's important, Alice said quickly. It's about Donovan King. The receptionist's eyes widened slightly at the name, but she didn't argue. Wait here. She disappeared into the newsroom, leaving Alice and Clara alone in the quiet lobby. Alice's stomach churned as they waited, the seconds stretching into what felt like hours. Finally, a tall woman with short, dark hair appeared. Her sharp eyes scanned the girls before she stepped forward, her heels clicking against the tile. I'm Rebecca Hale, she said, crossing her arms. You said you have information about Donovan King? Alice nodded, clutching her bag. Yes, it's about him and my dad. And a lion named Magnus. Rebecca's eyebrows rose. That's quite a combination. It's true, Alice insisted, her voice trembling. I have proof. She unzipped her bag and pulled out the USB drive and notebook, placing them on the desk. Rebecca eyed them skeptically but picked up the notebook, flipping through its pages. As she read, her expression shifted from skepticism to intrigue. This is a lot, Rebecca said finally. But if it's true, it's explosive. She looked at Alice. Do you have more? Alice nodded, her hands shaking as she held out the USB drive. This has videos of Magnus and of Donovan. Rebecca took the drive, her gaze thoughtful. Come with me. Rebecca led them to her office, where she plugged the USB drive into her computer. Alice and Clara watched nervously as the videos played, the grainy footage flickering on the screen. Rebecca's jaw tightened as she watched Donovan threaten Victor in the final clip. When the video ended, she turned to Alice, her expression grave. This is big, she said. If what you're saying is true, Donovan King is more dangerous than anyone realizes. Alice swallowed hard. Will you help us? Rebecca nodded. I will, but you need to be careful. Donovan won't go down without a fight. Alice nodded, relief washing over her. For the first time, she felt like someone was on her side. But outside, in the shadows of the alley, a figure watched them through the window. Greg pulled out his phone, his lips curling into a cruel smile as he dialed a number. She's here, he said. And she's not alone. Would Rebecca's help be enough to expose Donovan? Or had Alice just painted a target on all their backs? The atmosphere in Rebecca Hale's office was thick with tension. Alice sat stiffly in the chair across from the reporter's desk, her small hands folded tightly in her lap. Clara fidgeted beside her, glancing nervously at the windows. Rebecca, meanwhile, leaned back in her chair, her eyes sharp as she studied the girls. This footage, Rebecca said, gesturing toward the paused video of Donovan threatening Victor. If it's real, and I'm not saying I doubt you, it's damning. But taking down someone like Donovan King isn't easy. Alice's heart sank. You believe me, don't you? Rebecca softened, leaning forward. I do. But you have to understand, people like Donovan have money, power, and connections. If I publish this story, it's not just him who'll come after me. It's everyone in his circle. I don't care, Alice said, her voice trembling but firm. He ruined my family. He's the reason my dad is gone. And now he wants to hurt Magnus. You have to stop him. Rebecca sighed, rubbing her temples. It's not just about publishing a story, Alice. It's about getting people to care enough to act. If I run this, I'll need more evidence, more witnesses. Otherwise, it'll get buried. Alice exchanged a worried glance with Clara. What more could they give? Rebecca seemed to sense their hesitation. I'll start digging into Donovan's records. But you two need to be careful. If he finds out you've been talking to me... He already knows, Alice interrupted. Rebecca froze. What do you mean? Greg, his lawyer. He's been following us. He was at the bus station, Alice explained, her voice shaking. Rebecca's jaw tightened. That changes things. If Greg's involved, Donovan knows more than he's letting on. You can't go back home, Alice. Not tonight. Clara's eyes widened. What? Where will we go? Rebecca stood, pacing the small office. I have a friend. A safe place where you can stay for a night or two. I'll call her. Alice opened her mouth to protest but stopped when Rebecca held up a hand. This isn't up for debate. If Donovan's already watching you, it's not safe to go back. Meanwhile, in the dimly lit parking lot outside the Silver Ridge Gazette, Greg leaned against the hood of his car, his phone pressed to his ear. She's in there with Hale, Greg said, his voice cold. On the other end of the line, Donovan's voice was equally sharp. And you let her get that far? She's a kid, Greg snapped. I didn't think she'd have the guts to pull something like this. Donovan sighed, the sound low and dangerous. Get her out of there, Greg, and make it clean. We can't afford loose ends. Greg hung up, sliding his phone into his pocket. He turned toward the building, his expression dark. Back inside, Rebecca handed Alice and Clara a slip of paper with an address scrawled on it. This is where you'll go, she said. It's not far and my friend's trustworthy. You'll be safe there while I figure out our next move. Alice nodded, clutching the paper tightly. Thank you. Rebecca hesitated, placing a hand on Alice's shoulder. You're brave, Alice. Braver than most adults I know. But you have to promise me you'll stay out of sight. Let me handle this. I promise, Alice said, though her stomach twisted with doubt. She hated feeling helpless, like a pawn in someone else's game. Clara tugged at Alice's sleeve. We should go before it gets too late. Rebecca nodded, walking them to the back door. There's a cab waiting for you out front. Go straight to the address. Don't stop for anything. The girls stepped into the cool night air, their breaths visible in the glow of the streetlights. The cab was idling at the curb, its driver leaning against the hood. Alice's grip on the paper tightened as they approached. But before they could reach the car, a shadowy figure emerged from the alley. Greg. Well, he drawled, stepping into the light. Running off to play hero, Alice? Alice froze, her blood turning to ice. Clara grabbed her arm, pulling her back. Leave us alone, Clara said, her voice shaking. Greg chuckled darkly. I'm afraid I can't do that. Donovan doesn't like it when people meddle in his affairs. And you too? You've been very meddlesome. Alice glanced toward the cab, her mind racing. The driver had noticed the commotion and was reaching for his phone. Greg followed her gaze and smiled. Go ahead, he called to the driver. Call the police. But by the time they get here, it'll be too late for these two. Alice's heart pounded. She had to think fast. Without warning, she grabbed Clara's hand and bolted toward the cab. Get in, she shouted. The driver hesitated for only a second before opening the door. The girls scrambled inside, slamming the door shut as Greg lunged after them. Drive, Alice yelled. The driver didn't need to be told twice. He hit the gas, and the cab peeled away from the curb, leaving Greg shouting curses in their wake. The drive to the safe house was tense and silent. Clara clutched Alice's hand, her fingers trembling. Do you think he'll follow us? Clara whispered. Alice shook her head. I don't know, but we can't stop now. When they arrived at the address Rebecca had given them, the driver pulled up to a small, nondescript house at the end of a quiet street. A woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor greeted them at the door. You must be Alice and Clara, she said, ushering them inside. Rebecca told me you'd be coming. I'm Joan. Joan led them to a cozy living room, where a fire crackled in the hearth. You're safe here, she said. No one will find you. Alice nodded, but the weight of the USB drive in her bag reminded her that safety was temporary. Donovan wouldn't stop, not until he had silenced her for good. As she and Clara settled onto the couch, Alice's mind churned with possibilities. She needed a plan, and she needed it fast. Outside, in the shadows of the quiet street, Greg's car idled. He hadn't followed the cab, but he had other ways of finding out where they were. Pulling out his phone, he dialed a number. They're hiding, he said, his voice low. But not for long. Would Alice find a way to expose Donovan before he closed in on her? Or would her safe haven turn into another trap? The warmth of the fireplace in Joan's living room couldn't chase away the chill that lingered in Alice's chest. She sat cross-legged on the couch, staring into the flames as Clara rested beside her, finally succumbing to an uneasy sleep. Joan sat across from them in a worn armchair, knitting quietly. The rhythmic click of her needles was soothing, but Alice's mind refused to rest. "You're brave for coming this far," Joan said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but her gaze was piercing. "Not many kids your age would take on something this big." Alice glanced at her, gripping the edge of her notebook. "I didn't have a choice," she replied. "If I don't do something, Donovan will get away with everything. And Magnus, he'll pay the price." Joan nodded, setting her knitting aside. "Rebecca told me a little about your situation. I don't know what you're up against, but I can see it's weighing on you. Do you have a plan?" Alice hesitated. "We thought giving the evidence to Rebecca would be enough. But now, I don't know. Greg and Donovan won't stop, and I don't know how to make people listen." Joan leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees. "Sometimes it's not about getting everyone to listen. Sometimes you just need the right people to hear the truth. You're already doing more than most adults would. Don't lose sight of why you're fighting." Alice swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "I'm fighting because no one else will." Joan's expression softened. "Then you're stronger than you think." The quiet moment was shattered by the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside. Joan's head snapped toward the window, her hand instinctively reaching for the curtain. She peeked outside and froze. "What is it?" Alice asked, her voice trembling. Joan turned, her face grim. "A car just pulled up. Stay here." She moved swiftly to the front door, her footsteps barely making a sound. Alice scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding as she watched Joan peer through the peephole. "Who is it?" Alice whispered, clutching Clara's arm. Joan didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped back and motioned for them to follow her. "We're going out the back," she said quietly. "Now?" Alice didn't hesitate. She grabbed her bag and shook Clara awake. "Come on. We have to go." Clara blinked groggily but obeyed, following Joan as she led them through the kitchen and out the back door. The night air was cold, and the narrow alley behind the house felt like a tunnel closing in around them. Joan motioned for the girls to stay close as she guided them toward a side street. "Where are we going?" Alice asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's an old church a few blocks away," Joan said. "It's safe there. We'll—" She was cut off by the sound of footsteps behind them. Alice glanced over her shoulder and saw two men in dark suits moving quickly down the alley. "Run!" Joan hissed, pushing the girls ahead of her. They sprinted through the alley, their breaths coming in short gasps. Alice's bag bounced against her back, the weight of the USB drive and notebook a constant reminder of what was at stake. The alley opened onto a busy street, and Joan steered them into the crowd. The noise and movement offered some cover, but Alice could still feel the men's presence like a shadow at her back. "Keep moving," Joan urged, her hand on Clara's shoulder. They weaved through the throng of people, ducking into a narrow passage between two buildings. Joan stopped abruptly, pressing her back against the wall and motioning for the girls to do the same. The sound of the men's voices carried through the alley. "They couldn't have gone far," one of them said. "Check the main street." Alice held her breath, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel Clara trembling beside her, and she reached out to squeeze her friend's hand. The voices faded as the men moved away, but Joan didn't relax. "We can't stay here. Come on." The church loomed ahead, its tall spire silhouetted against the night sky. Joan led them through a side entrance, the heavy wooden door creaking as it closed behind them. The interior was dimly lit, the faint glow of candles casting flickering shadows on the walls. Joan guided them to a small room at the back of the sanctuary, where an older man in a priest's collar greeted them. "Joan," he said, his voice filled with concern. "What's going on?" "These girls are in trouble, Father Michael," Joan explained quickly. "They need a safe place to stay." Father Michael nodded, his expression grave. "They'll be safe here. Come with me." He led them to a small sitting room filled with worn furniture and shelves lined with books. Alice sank into a chair, her legs shaking from exhaustion. "Thank you," she said quietly. Father Michael offered a kind smile. "You're welcome. Rest for now. We'll figure out what to do next in the morning." As the hours ticked by, Alice couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the quiet street below. The weight of everything pressed heavily on her. Her father's disappearance, Donovan's threats, Magnus' fate. Clara stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly. Alice reached for her bag and pulled out the notebook, flipping through the pages. She stopped on the page with the photo of Donovan and Victor, her fingers tracing the image. "What are you hiding?" she whispered to herself. She thought of Victor's words. "Donovan doesn't leave loose ends." Alice's gaze shifted to the USB drive. The videos were powerful evidence, but were they enough? As the first light of dawn broke through the window, Alice made a decision. The next morning, Joan returned with a plate of toast and scrambled eggs. "You need to eat," she said, setting the plate in front of Alice. Alice nodded absently, her mind elsewhere. "Joan, I need to talk to Rebecca again." Joan frowned. "It's too dangerous. If Greg and his men are still looking for you, they'll find me no matter what," Alice interrupted. "I can't just sit here and wait. Rebecca can help. She's the only one who can get this story out." Joan sighed, her expression conflicted. "If that's what you want, I'll help you get there. But you need to be careful." "I will," Alice promised. As Joan made preparations to get Alice and Clara back to Rebecca, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. In a dark room somewhere in Willow Creek, Donovan sat at a desk, his fingers steepled as he listened to Greg's report. "They're hiding at a church," Greg said. "But it won't be long before they make their next move." Donovan's lips curled into a thin smile. "Good. Let them. It'll make them easier to catch." Would Alice reach Rebecca before Donovan closed in? Or was she walking straight into a trap? The gray skies over Silver Ridge mirrored the unease in Alice's chest as she climbed into Joan's old station wagon. Clara sat beside her, clutching her backpack tightly, her wide eyes scanning the empty street outside the church. Joan started the engine, her jaw set with determination. "I'll take you as close to the Gazette as I can," Joan said. "But if anything feels off, we'll turn around." "Understood." Alice nodded. "Understood." Father Michael waved them off from the church steps, his expression shadowed with concern. The car rolled down the quiet street, the rumble of the engine the only sound in the early morning stillness. As they approached the downtown area, Alice's thoughts churned. She clutched her bag to her chest, the weight of the USB drive and notebook a constant reminder of the risk they were taking. If Donovan's men caught them again, they might not get away so easily. "Joan," Alice said hesitantly, "why are you helping us? You don't even know us." Joan glanced at Alice in the rearview mirror, her eyes softening. "Because sometimes standing by isn't an option. You're just a kid, Alice. You shouldn't have to carry this on your own." Alice felt a lump rise in her throat. She wasn't used to adults stepping up for her. When they reached the Gazette building, Joan pulled into a nearby parking lot, her eyes scanning the street for anything suspicious. "Looks clear," she said. "I'll wait here. If anything happens, you come straight back." Alice and Clara nodded, slipping out of the car and hurrying toward the building's entrance. The weight of their mission pressed down on them with every step. Rebecca was waiting for them in her office, her expression tense. She stood as they entered, locking the door behind them. "You made it," she said, her voice low. "Good. We don't have much time." Alice set her bag on the desk, pulling out the USB drive and notebook. "We brought everything." Rebecca took the drive, plugging it into her computer. As the videos played, her expression grew darker. "This is damning," she muttered, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she copied the files. "If we release this, Donovan won't be able to deny his involvement. But we'll need corroboration, testimony from Victor, records of the money trail." "Victor will help," Alice said quickly. "He gave me the videos. He wants to stop Donovan too." Rebecca nodded. "Good. I'll reach out to him. But Alice, you need to be prepared. Once this goes public, Donovan will come after everyone involved, including you. Alice's stomach twisted, but she nodded. I don't care. He has to be stopped. Rebecca hesitated, then placed a hand on Alice's shoulder. You're braver than most adults I know, but don't underestimate him. He's dangerous. As Rebecca continued working, Alice glanced out the window. A black car was parked across the street, its engine idling. Her heart sank as she recognized the sharp silhouette of Greg sitting in the driver's seat. Rebecca, Alice whispered urgently. He's here. Rebecca joined her at the window, her expression hardening. Damn it. They must have followed you. What do we do? Clara asked, her voice shaking. Rebecca grabbed her phone and dialed quickly. Joan, it's Rebecca. Greg's here. Get out of the parking lot and find somewhere safe. I'll take care of the girls. She hung up and turned to Alice and Clara. We're leaving. Now. Rebecca led them out the back door of the Gazette building, her eyes scanning the alley for any signs of movement. Stay close, she whispered, motioning for them to follow. The alley opened onto a narrow street filled with delivery trucks and early morning pedestrians. Rebecca guided them toward a crowded cafe, pulling them inside and finding a table near the back. We'll stay here until it's safe to move, Rebecca said, her voice low. Greg won't risk causing a scene in public. Alice nodded, though her nerves were frayed. Every time the cafe door opened, she flinched, half expecting Greg or one of Donovan's men to storm in. An hour passed before Rebecca deemed it safe to leave. She called a cab, and the three of them slipped out a side entrance, blending into the flow of pedestrians. The cab took them to a small motel on the outskirts of Silver Ridge, where Rebecca rented a room under a fake name. She led Alice and Clara inside, locking the door behind them. This will have to do for now, Rebecca said. Stay here. I'll go back to the Gazette and finish compiling the evidence. Once I have everything, I'll send it to the authorities and publish the story. Alice looked up at her, fear flickering in her eyes. What if they come here? Rebecca knelt in front of her, gripping her shoulders firmly. They won't find you, but if anything happens, call this number. She handed Alice a piece of paper with a phone number scribbled on it. It's a friend of mine, someone I trust. They'll help you. Alice nodded, clutching the paper tightly. As the day wore on, Alice and Clara stayed inside the motel room, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. Clara tried to distract herself by flipping through the TV channels, but Alice couldn't relax. She sat by the window, watching the empty parking lot below. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. I don't like this, Alice muttered. What if Rebecca doesn't come back? She will, Clara said, though her voice lacked conviction. She's tough. Alice sighed, her gaze drifting to her bag. The notebook and USB drive were gone now, safely in Rebecca's hands. But a part of her felt exposed without them, like she'd lost her shield. That night, as Clara slept fitfully on one of the motel beds, Alice lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She thought of her father, his worried words in the journal, his desperate attempt to protect her from Donovan. She thought of Magnus, locked away and misunderstood, the only one who had saved her when everyone else had failed. I won't let them win, she whispered to herself. But as the hours ticked by, her resolve was tested. A car pulled into the parking lot, its headlights sweeping across the motel. Alice tensed, her breath catching as she watched the driver step out. It was Greg. Her pulse quickened as he approached the motel office, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering light of the sign. Alice scrambled to wake Clara. Get up. He's here. Clara bolted upright, her eyes wide with panic. What do we do? Alice grabbed her bag and headed for the door. We run. Would they escape Greg's grasp again? Or had Donovan's men finally caught up to them? The faint hum of the motel sign outside seemed louder than ever as Alice and Clara crept toward the back door of the room. Every creak of the floorboards felt like an alarm bell, threatening to alert Greg to their movements. Alice's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. Are you sure we should run? Clara whispered, clutching her backpack like a lifeline. Alice nodded, her face pale but determined. If we stay, Greg will find us. We have to go now. She twisted the doorknob carefully, wincing as it let out a soft squeak. The door opened onto a narrow alley behind the motel, dimly lit by a single flickering streetlight. "Stay close to me," Alice whispered, stepping outside and pulling Clara with her. They moved quickly and quietly down the alley, the cool night air biting at their skin. Alice glanced over her shoulder every few steps, half expecting to see Greg or one of Donovan's men closing in. The street ahead was empty, but Alice knew better than to trust appearances. "Where are we going?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Alice hesitated. She didn't have a plan, only a desperate need to keep moving. "We'll head toward the main road," she said finally. "Maybe we can find someone to help." Clara didn't argue, though her fear was evident in the way she clung to Alice's arm. As they reached the end of the alley, a car engine roared to life behind them. Alice froze, her stomach lurching. She turned to see Greg's sleek black sedan pulling out of the motel parking lot, its headlights sweeping across the street. "He's looking for us," Alice said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Come on," Clara urged, tugging her toward a row of parked cars. "We can hide over there." The girls ducked behind a large SUV, crouching low as Greg's car slowly rolled past. Alice held her breath, her fingers digging into the asphalt beneath her. Greg's car came to a stop at the end of the street, his silhouette visible through the windshield. He seemed to hesitate before turning the car around and driving back toward the motel. Alice let out a shaky breath, her limbs trembling with relief. "We have to keep moving." The girls made their way down the empty street, sticking to the shadows as much as possible. The city felt like a ghost town, its usual bustle replaced by an eerie silence. As they turned a corner, they spotted a gas station up ahead, its neon sign casting a pale glow over the surrounding area. "Let's go there," Clara said, pointing. "Maybe someone inside can help us." Alice hesitated. The gas station was brightly lit, making it impossible to stay hidden. But it was also the only sign of life for miles. "Okay," she said finally, "but we have to be quick." Inside the gas station, the clerk barely looked up from his phone as the girls entered. Alice approached the counter, her voice shaking as she spoke. "Excuse me, do you have a phone we can use?" The clerk glanced at her, his bored expression barely changing. "Payphone's outside," he muttered, nodding toward the parking lot. Alice's shoulders slumped. "Thanks," she said, turning away. Clara tugged at her sleeve. "What now?" Alice looked toward the payphone outside, dread pooling in her stomach. It was too exposed, too risky, but they didn't have a choice. "We'll call Rebecca," Alice said. "She'll know what to do." As they stepped outside, the sound of an approaching car made Alice's blood run cold. She turned toward the street, her heart sinking as Greg's black sedan came into view. "He's back," Alice whispered. Clara's eyes widened. "What do we do?" Alice's mind raced. The payphone was only a few feet away, but reaching it would mean stepping directly into Greg's line of sight. "We run," Alice said, grabbing Clara's hand. They bolted across the parking lot, weaving between parked cars as Greg's sedan screeched to a stop. "Alice!" Greg shouted, his voice sharp and angry. Alice didn't look back. She and Clara sprinted toward a narrow alley behind the gas station, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The sound of Greg's footsteps echoed behind them, growing louder with each passing second. The alley opened onto another street, this one lined with boarded-up shops and abandoned buildings. Alice's lungs burned as she scanned her surroundings, desperate for a place to hide. "There," Clara said, pointing to a small door tucked between two buildings. They raced toward it, yanking it open and slipping inside. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew filled their noses. Alice pressed her ear to the door, listening for any sign of Greg. The sound of his footsteps faded into the distance, and she let out a shaky breath. "I think we lost him," she whispered. Clara collapsed onto the floor, her chest heaving. "What now?" Alice sat beside her, her mind racing. "We need to find Rebecca. She's the only one who can help us now." "But how?" Clara asked. "We don't even know where she is." Alice pulled the piece of paper from her pocket, Rebecca's number scrawled across it. She glanced toward the door, her resolve hardening. We'll find another phone, she said. And we'll call her. Outside, Greg paced the gas station parking lot, his jaw clenched in frustration. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number, his tone sharp when the call connected. They slipped away, he said, but they're still in the area. They can't have gone far. On the other end of the line, Donovan's voice was cold and calculating. Then find them. I don't care how. Just make sure they're dealt with. Greg hung up, his grip tightening on the phone. He scanned the empty street, his eyes narrowing. I'll find you, Alice, he muttered. And when I do, this ends. Would Alice and Clara find Rebecca before Greg closed in again? Or had their luck finally run out? The air inside the abandoned building was heavy, thick with dust that seemed to hang in the dim light filtering through broken windows. Alice sat cross-legged on the cold concrete floor, gripping Rebecca's phone number in her trembling hands. Clara huddled beside her, her knees drawn up to her chest. We can't stay here, Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Alice nodded, her mind racing. I know, but we can't keep running blindly either. We need to find a way to call Rebecca. Outside, the faint sound of Greg's car engine echoed through the empty streets. He was still out there, circling like a predator waiting for its prey to stumble. Alice felt the weight of his presence. Even when she couldn't see him, Clara shifted nervously. Do you think Rebecca got away? What if he found her too? She's smart, Alice said, more to convince herself than Clara. She'll find us if we can just get a message to her. As the hours dragged on, the cold seeped into their bones. Alice paced the room, peeking through cracks in the boarded-up windows. The street outside was quiet, but she knew Greg wouldn't give up so easily. We have to move, Alice said finally. If we wait too long, he'll find us. Clara's eyes widened. Where will we go? Alice bit her lip, considering their options. We'll head to the library. There's bound to be a phone there, and it's public. He won't try anything with people around. Clara hesitated but nodded. Okay. The girls slipped out of the building, sticking to the shadows as they made their way toward the library. The city felt eerie in its stillness, the occasional car passing by like a phantom in the night. Alice's grip on Clara's hand tightened as they approached the library's front steps. The building was large and imposing, its towering columns casting long shadows in the moonlight. Do you think it's open? Clara asked, her voice trembling. We'll find out, Alice replied, climbing the steps cautiously. She pushed on the heavy wooden door, relieved when it gave way with a soft creak. The warm glow of the interior lights spilled out, welcoming them inside. The library was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of pages and the soft hum of a ceiling fan. A lone librarian sat at the front desk, her nose buried in a book. Alice approached her hesitantly. Excuse me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The librarian looked up, her expression kind but curious. Can I help you? We need to use the phone, Alice said. It's an emergency. The librarian's brow furrowed, but she nodded, gesturing toward a desk phone near the entrance. Go ahead. Alice hurried to the phone, pulling Rebecca's number from her pocket. She dialed quickly, her heart pounding as the line rang. Come on, she muttered under her breath. Pick up. Finally, Rebecca's voice crackled on the other end. Hello, Rebecca. It's Alice, she said, relief flooding her voice. Alice, Rebecca said, her tone urgent. Where are you? Are you safe? We're at the library, Alice said. Greg's still looking for us. We barely got away. Stay where you are, Rebecca said firmly. I'll come to you. Don't move until I get there. Alice nodded, though Rebecca couldn't see her. Okay, please hurry. Rebecca arrived 20 minutes later, her car screeching to a halt outside the library. Alice and Clara rushed out to meet her, their hearts pounding with both fear and relief. Get in, Rebecca said, ushering them into the back seat. As soon as they were inside, Rebecca pulled away from the curb, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. Did anyone see you come here? No, Alice said. I don't think so. Rebecca's jaw tightened. Good. We can't afford any more close calls. As the car sped through the dark streets, Rebecca filled them in on her progress. I've compiled all the evidence, she said. The videos, the notebook, Victor's testimony. It's all ready. But there's a problem. Alice frowned. What kind of problem? Donovan has people everywhere, Rebecca said grimly. If we publish the story now, he'll find a way to bury it. We need to hit him where it hurts. Publicly and all at once. I've arranged a press conference for tomorrow morning. Once the story breaks, he won't be able to cover it up. Alice's stomach churned. A press conference? Isn't that dangerous? Very, Rebecca admitted. But it's our best shot. The more people who hear the truth, the harder it'll be for Donovan to silence us. Rebecca drove them to a small, secure location where they would spend the night. The building was nondescript, tucked away in an industrial area far from prying eyes. Inside, Rebecca pulled out a map and spread it on the table. This is where the press conference will be, she said, pointing to a large hotel downtown. We'll go in the morning. Until then, stay here and stay quiet. Alice nodded, though her nerves were frayed. The thought of facing Donovan, or worse, Greg, at the press conference made her stomach twist. Do you think this will work? Clara asked, her voice small. Rebecca looked at her, her expression resolute. It has to. That night, Alice barely slept. She lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling above her, the weight of the USB drive's contents pressing down on her. Her thoughts turned to her father. She pictured his face, the way his eyes had been filled with worry in the days leading up to the incident at the lake. She thought of his journal, his desperate attempts to shield her from Donovan's threats. I'll make this right, Dad, she whispered into the darkness. But deep down, she knew the road ahead would be far from easy. The next morning, as they prepared to leave for the press conference, Rebecca's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen, her expression darkening. It's Victor, she said, answering quickly. Victor? What's wrong? Alice's heart sank as Rebecca's face went pale. They've found him, Rebecca said, her voice shaking. Donovan's men took Victor. Would they be able to save Victor and still expose Donovan? Or had their fight just taken a dangerous new turn? The air in the small room felt heavy as Rebecca hung up the phone, her expression grim. Alice and Clara stood frozen, their eyes wide with fear. What do you mean they took Victor? Alice asked, her voice trembling. Rebecca ran a hand through her hair, pacing the room. Victor called me this morning to check in. He said he'd noticed someone watching his house. I told him to leave immediately, but he didn't make it. Donovan's men got to him first. Alice felt a wave of panic wash over her. We have to help him. Rebecca stopped pacing, her eyes locking onto Alice's. We will, but we can't rush into this blindly. Donovan's men will be watching Victor, and if we're not careful, we'll walk straight into a trap. Clara spoke up, her voice small. What will they do to him? Rebecca hesitated, her expression hardening. Donovan doesn't like loose ends. If we don't act quickly, Victor could. He could disappear for good. The gravity of her words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the stakes they were facing. Rebecca grabbed her laptop and began typing furiously, her brow furrowed in concentration. Alice hovered at her side, her hands clenched into fists. What are you doing? Alice asked. I'm contacting a few people I trust, Rebecca replied. We need eyes on where Donovan's men are holding Victor. If we can confirm his location, we might have a chance to get him out. Alice's mind raced. She thought of the USB drive, the videos of Magnus, and the notebook filled with evidence against Donovan. Everything Victor had risked to help her now hung in the balance. We can't let him down, Alice said quietly. Rebecca nodded. We won't. An hour later, Rebecca's phone buzzed with an incoming message. She opened it quickly, her eyes scanning the screen. Got it, she said, standing abruptly. Victor's being held at an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. My contact says it's lightly guarded for now, but that could change any minute. Alice stood as well, determination hardening her features. We're going. No, Rebecca said firmly. You're staying here. What? Alice protested. You can't leave us behind. Victor needs us. Rebecca knelt in front of her, placing her hands on Alice's shoulders. Listen to me. This isn't about bravery or loyalty. It's about staying alive. If something happens to you, everything we've worked for will fall apart. You've done enough, Alice. Let me handle this. Alice's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded reluctantly. She hated feeling helpless, but she knew Rebecca was right. Rebecca left shortly after, promising to return with Victor. Alice and Clara sat in tense silence, the minutes dragging by like hours. "Do you think she'll be okay?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alice stared at the door Rebecca had walked through, her heart heavy. "I don't know," she admitted. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on them as they waited, the quiet room amplifying every creak and rustle. At the warehouse, Rebecca crouched behind a stack of crates, her sharp eyes scanning the area. The building was dimly lit, its windows boarded up, and only a single guard stood at the entrance. She crept closer, her footsteps silent against the gravel. The guard's phone buzzed, distracting him for just a moment, long enough for Rebecca to slip past him and into the building. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and rust. Rebecca moved cautiously, her ears straining for any sound. She found Victor in a small room at the back of the warehouse, tied to a chair. His face was bruised, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. "Rebecca," he rasped. "What are you doing here?" "Saving you," she whispered, pulling a knife from her pocket and cutting the ropes around his wrists. Victor winced as he stood, but he managed to steady himself. "Donovan's men will be back any minute. We have to move." Rebecca nodded, helping him toward the exit. But as they approached the door, the sound of voices stopped them in their tracks. "They're here," Victor said, his voice tight. Rebecca's mind raced. They couldn't go back the way they came, but the longer they stayed, the greater the risk. "This way," she whispered, guiding Victor toward a side door. Back at the safe house, Alice paced the room, her anxiety building with each passing minute. "We should have gone with her," she said, her voice filled with frustration. Clara shook her head. "Rebecca told us to stay. We have to trust her." Alice stopped, her fists clenched. What if she doesn't come back? What if Donovan finds her too? Before Clara could respond, a sharp knock at the door made them both jump. "Rebecca?" Alice called out, hope rising in her chest. But as she opened the door, her heart sank. Standing on the other side was Greg, his smirk cold and calculating. "Well, hello, Alice," he said, stepping inside. "You've been very hard to find." Clara shrank back, her face pale with fear. Alice moved to block Greg's path, her small frame trembling but defiant. "Get out," she said, her voice steady despite the terror bubbling inside her. Greg chuckled, shaking his head. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But this game you've been playing? It ends now." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Where's Rebecca?" Alice glared at him, refusing to answer. Greg's smile faded, replaced by a cold, menacing glare. "You think you're clever, don't you? But let me tell you something, Alice. People like me always win. And people like you, you're just collateral damage." Before Alice could respond, the sound of a car screeching to a halt outside caught Greg's attention. Rebecca burst through the door, her face flushed and furious. Behind her, Victor leaned heavily on the doorframe, but he was alive. "Get away from them," Rebecca demanded, her voice like steel. Greg raised his hands in mock surrender, his smirk returning. "Relax, Rebecca. I was just saying hello." "You've said enough," Rebecca snapped. "Now leave, or I'll make sure Donovan knows just how much you've messed up." Greg hesitated, his jaw tightening. But after a moment, he turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Alice ran to Rebecca, throwing her arms around her. "You found him." Rebecca nodded, her eyes softening. "He's safe. For now." Victor managed a weak smile. Thanks to Rebecca, Alice's relief was short-lived. She knew Greg and Donovan wouldn't give up. The battle was far from over. Would the press conference expose Donovan's crimes? Or would he strike back before they had the chance? The following morning broke with a heavy sense of dread hanging in the air. The press conference was hours away, and every minute felt like an eternity. Rebecca and Victor had been working nonstop, organizing the evidence and preparing statements that would leave no room for Donovan's lies. Alice sat at the table with Clara, nervously picking at the edge of her notebook. Though Rebecca had assured her they were safe for now, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that Greg or Donovan would appear at any moment. "What if it doesn't work?" Clara asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Alice glanced at her friend, her own doubts mirrored in Clara's wide eyes. "It has to," Alice said firmly, though the words felt hollow. "If it doesn't, Magnus, Victor, and everyone who tried to help me, it'll all be for nothing." Rebecca looked up from her laptop, her expression sharp. "It's going to work," she said, her voice steady. "Donovan thrives in the shadows. He manipulates people, silences them. But once the truth is out in the open, he won't be able to hide anymore." Victor, seated beside her, nodded grimly. "He'll fight back, though. Donovan won't go down without a fight." By the time they left for the press conference, Alice's nerves were frayed. Rebecca's contact had arranged for the event to take place in a large, secure ballroom at a downtown hotel. Journalists from across the state had been invited, along with several animal rights organizations. The ride to the hotel was tense and silent. Alice clutched the notebook in her lap, staring out the window as the city rushed past. Clara sat beside her, fidgeting with her hands, while Rebecca and Victor spoke in hushed tones in the front seat. As they approached the hotel, Alice spotted a line of news vans parked outside, their logos emblazoned on the sides. A crowd had already begun to gather, reporters clutching cameras and notepads as they waited for the event to begin. "This is it," Rebecca said as she parked the car. "Once we step inside, there's no turning back." Alice took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "I'm ready." Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere was electric. Lights from cameras flashed, and the hum of conversations filled the air. A stage had been set up at the front of the room, flanked by large screens that would display the evidence against Donovan. Rebecca guided Alice and Clara to a small table at the back of the room, where they would remain until it was time for Alice to speak. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready," Rebecca said, crouching down to Alice's level. "Just say the word, and I'll handle it." Alice shook her head, her resolve firm. "No, I need to do this. People need to hear the truth." Rebecca smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "You're braver than most adults I know, Alice." The press conference began with Rebecca stepping onto the stage, her presence commanding as she addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "Today, we're here to expose the truth about Donovan King, a man who has built his fortune on lies, manipulation, and exploitation. The evidence we're about to present will prove beyond a doubt that he has committed heinous crimes, not only against animals but also against innocent people." As Rebecca spoke, the screens behind her lit up with footage from the USB drive. Clips of Magnus rescuing mannequins, comforting people, and performing life-saving actions played in succession, each one a testament to the lion's extraordinary training. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as the final video played, the one where Donovan threatened Victor, his voice cold and calculating. "This is the man you've trusted," Rebecca said, her voice sharp. "A man who sees others as tools to be used and discarded. A man who is willing to destroy lives to protect his secrets." As Rebecca continued, Alice's attention was drawn to the back of the room. A figure had slipped in quietly, his sharp features unmistakable even in the dim light. "Greg." Alice's stomach churned as she watched him move toward the side of the room, speaking into his phone. "He's here," Alice whispered to Clara, her voice shaking. Clara's eyes widened. "What do we do?" Alice glanced at Rebecca on the stage, then at Victor, who was seated nearby. She had to warn them. "I'll tell Rebecca," Alice said, rising from her chair. "Stay here." Alice made her way to the stage, her small frame weaving through the crowd unnoticed. She reached Rebecca just as Greg began moving toward the front of the room. "Rebecca," Alice whispered urgently, tugging on her sleeve. "Greg's here." Rebecca's eyes narrowed, her gaze sweeping the room. She spotted Greg immediately, his smirk chilling as he made his way closer. Rebecca leaned into the microphone, her voice steady. It seems we have an unexpected guest. Mr. Gregory Mitchell, Donovan King's personal lawyer, has decided to join us today. Perhaps he'd like to address the evidence presented. All eyes turned to Greg, whose smirk faltered for a moment before he regained his composure. I'm here to ensure that baseless accusations don't tarnish the reputation of an innocent man, Greg said smoothly, his tone oozing confidence. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. Innocent? Care to explain the footage of Donovan threatening Victor? Or the evidence of financial corruption tied directly to his accounts? Greg opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Alice stepped forward. "He's lying," she shouted, her voice trembling but loud enough to carry through the room. "He's been following us, trying to stop us from telling the truth. Donovan doesn't care about anyone but himself. He hurt my family. He made my dad disappear, and he's trying to kill Magnus." The room erupted into chaos as reporters clamored for details, their cameras flashing and voices overlapping. Greg's face darkened, his facade cracking under the weight of Alice's words. He took a step toward her, but Rebecca moved between them, her expression fierce. "That's enough, Greg," Rebecca said, her voice like steel. "You're done." Victor stepped forward, his presence commanding. "You've been protecting Donovan for too long. It's over." Greg glared at them, his fists clenched. "You have no idea what you've started." The press conference ended with a flurry of questions and promises of further investigation. Alice, Clara, Rebecca, and Victor slipped out through a side entrance, their hearts pounding with both relief and fear. "We did it," Clara said, her voice filled with wonder. "We told them." Alice nodded, but her relief was tempered by the knowledge that Donovan wouldn't go down without a fight. As they climbed into Rebecca's car, Alice glanced out the window, her gaze lingering on the hotel as it disappeared into the distance. Would the evidence be enough to bring Donovan to justice, or was the battle far from over? The ride back from the press conference was a blur of tense silence and rapid breaths. Alice sat with her forehead pressed against the cold window, her mind racing with the day's events. Beside her, Clara fidgeted nervously, while Rebecca kept her eyes locked on the road, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Victor sat in the passenger seat, his face grim. "Donovan won't take this lying down," he said, breaking the silence. The press conference hit him where it hurts, but it also painted a target on all of us. Rebecca nodded, her jaw set. "That's why we need to be prepared. The evidence is out there now, but Donovan still has power, and he'll use it." Alice's voice trembled as she spoke. "Do you think the police will do anything?" "They'll have to," Rebecca replied. "The evidence we presented today is too big to ignore. But Donovan has connections in law enforcement. He'll try to stall or twist the narrative." Alice's stomach twisted with anxiety. She couldn't shake the image of Greg's cold smirk as he walked through the ballroom. He hadn't looked worried. He'd looked calculating, as if already planning his next move. When they returned to the safe house, the tension in the air was palpable. Rebecca parked the car and ushered everyone inside, locking the door behind them. "We need to stay put for now," Rebecca said. "The press will start digging into Donovan, and that will buy us some time. But we have to be careful." Victor sank onto the couch, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion. "This isn't over," he muttered. "Donovan won't go down without a fight." Alice sat at the kitchen table, her hands shaking as she pulled out the notebook. She flipped through the pages, her heart sinking with every line she read. The weight of the secrets she had uncovered was overwhelming. Clara sat beside her, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "We did everything we could, Alice. Now we just have to wait." Alice nodded, though the thought of waiting felt unbearable. Hours passed in uneasy silence, the group too tense to sleep or relax. Alice found herself pacing the small living room, her mind racing with possibilities. "What if he comes after us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca looked up from her laptop, her expression serious. "If Donovan tries anything, we'll be ready. He's desperate now, and desperate people make mistakes." As night fell, the tension in the house grew thicker. The sound of a car engine outside made everyone freeze. Rebecca moved to the window, peeking peeking through the curtains. "It's just a neighbor," she said. Though her voice was tight, Alice's heart didn't stop racing. Every noise, every shadow felt like a threat. Late that night, as the others tried to rest, Alice sat by the window, her thoughts heavy. The notebook sat on her lap, its pages filled with her father's words and the evidence she had collected. She thought of Magnus, locked away and awaiting execution for a crime he hadn't committed. She thought of her father, forced to flee because of Donovan's threats. "I won't let him win," Alice whispered to herself. The next morning, Rebecca's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She answered quickly, her expression tense. "Rebecca Hale," she said. The voice on the other end was sharp and urgent. "This is Detective Price with the Silver Ridge Police Department. I need to speak with you about the evidence presented at yesterday's press conference." Rebecca motioned for silence, her eyes narrowing. "What about it?" "We've reviewed the footage and the financial records," Detective Price said. "It's compelling. But there's a problem. Donovan's lawyers have already filed an injunction to block further investigation. They're claiming the evidence was obtained illegally." Rebecca's face darkened. "That's ridiculous. Everything was gathered legally." "Be that as it may," Price said, "it's enough to slow us down. We need more concrete proof. Something that can't be dismissed as circumstantial." Rebecca sighed, running a hand through her hair. "We'll get it," she said. "But you need to keep the pressure on Donovan. Don't let him slip away." "We'll do what we can," Price replied. "But be careful. Donovan's playing dirty, and I don't want anyone getting hurt." When Rebecca relayed the conversation to the group, Alice's frustration boiled over. "They're just letting him get away with it?" she demanded, her voice rising. "After everything we've done?" "They're not letting him get away," Rebecca said firmly. "They're building a case. But Donovan's smart, he knows how to exploit the system. That's why we need to stay ahead of him." Victor spoke up, his voice heavy. "There's one more thing we haven't shared yet. Something that could seal the case against Donovan." Rebecca frowned. "What is it?" Victor hesitated, glancing at Alice. "Donovan's warehouse. It's not just a hideout. It's where he keeps his real secrets. Records, contracts, everything he doesn't want the world to see. If we can get in there..." Rebecca's eyes widened. "That's incredibly risky. And how do we even know it's still there?" "I know," Victor said. "Trust me. Donovan's too arrogant to get rid of it." Alice stepped forward, her eyes blazing with determination. "We have to do it. If we don't, he'll keep winning." Rebecca hesitated, weighing the risks. "If we go after this, we'll have one shot. If anything goes wrong..." "It won't," Alice said firmly. "We'll make it work." The group spent the rest of the day planning their next move. Victor drew a rough map of the warehouse, marking the locations of entrances and potential guards. Rebecca made calls to her contacts, ensuring they would have backup if needed. As the sun set, the house buzzed with quiet determination. "Are you sure about this?" Clara asked Alice as they sat together, waiting for the final plan to come together. Alice nodded. "If we don't do this, Donovan wins. And I can't let that happen." Would their plan to infiltrate Donovan's warehouse succeed? Or would they walk into a trap? The night was silent, save for the low rumble of the car engine as Rebecca drove toward the outskirts of Silver Ridge. The safe house had been left behind, and now Alice, Clara, Victor, and Rebecca were heading straight toward the heart of Donovan's operation. Alice sat in the back seat with Clara, clutching the notebook tightly. Her palms were sweaty, and her chest felt tight with nerves, but her determination burned brighter than her fear. "This is it," Victor said from the passenger seat, his voice low but steady. "Donovan's warehouse is just up ahead." Rebecca's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Once we're inside, we have to move fast. Get what we need and get out before Donovan realizes we're there." Alice nodded, though her stomach churned at the thought of what might happen if they were caught. The warehouse loomed ahead, a massive structure shrouded in darkness. Its windows were blacked out, and the only sign of life was a single guard patrolling the perimeter with a flashlight. Rebecca parked the car a safe distance away, turning off the headlights. "Everyone knows the plan?" she asked, turning to face the group. Victor nodded. "We'll enter through the side door here," he said, pointing to a spot on the map he had drawn earlier. "That's where Donovan keeps his office. The records should be inside." Alice and Clara exchanged a glance. The tension in the car was palpable, but they knew there was no turning back now. They crept through the shadows, keeping low to avoid the beam of the guard's flashlight. Rebecca led the way, her movements silent and precise. Victor followed, his steps steady despite the weight of the mission ahead. When they reached the side door, Rebecca produced a small toolkit and began working on the lock. It clicked open after a few tense moments, and she motioned for the others to follow her inside. The air inside the warehouse was stale and heavy, the faint hum of machinery filling the silence. Rows of metal shelves stretched into the darkness, each one piled high with boxes and crates. "This way," Victor whispered, leading them toward the back of the building. The office was a small, windowless room hidden behind a stack of crates. Victor pushed the door open cautiously, his eyes scanning the space. Inside, a desk covered in papers and a locked filing cabinet were illuminated by a single overhead light. A computer sat on the desk, its screen dark. "This is it," Victor said, stepping inside. Rebecca moved to the computer, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she attempted to access the files. Victor rummaged through the desk drawers, while Alice and Clara stood guard by the door. "Hurry," Alice whispered, her heart racing. "We don't have much time." Rebecca cursed under her breath as the computer screen flashed red. "He's got everything password protected. I'll need more time to crack it." Victor pulled a folder from the desk, flipping through its contents. "These are contracts, names, dates, payments. This is what we need." Alice's stomach tightened as she listened to their hurried movements. Every second felt like an eternity, the fear of discovery pressing down on her like a weight. The sound of voices outside the office made everyone freeze. Rebecca's fingers stilled on the keyboard, and Victor dropped the folder, his eyes snapping to the door. "Someone's coming," Alice whispered, her voice trembling. Rebecca grabbed the folder and shoved it into her bag. "We're out of time. Let's go." They slipped out of the office and into the shadows of the warehouse, their movements quick and silent. The voices grew louder, and the beam of a flashlight swept across the walls. "Check the office," one of the men said. Alice's breath caught in her throat as she and Clara crouched behind a stack of crates. The men entered the office, their footsteps heavy on the concrete floor. "They'll find out we were there," Clara whispered, her voice shaking. Alice nodded, her mind racing. "We have to move." Rebecca led them toward the exit, but just as they neared the door, the beam of a flashlight caught them. "Hey!" one of the guards shouted. "Run!" Rebecca yelled. They bolted for the door, the sound of pounding footsteps and shouts echoing behind them. Alice's legs burned as she sprinted through the shadows, her heart hammering in her chest. They burst through the side door and into the night, the cool air hitting Alice's face like a slap. Rebecca pulled the car around, and they scrambled inside as the guards spilled out of the warehouse, their shouts growing louder. "Go, go, go!" Victor shouted. Rebecca floored the gas pedal, and the car sped away, the tires screeching against the pavement. The ride back to the safe house was filled with heavy breathing and tense silence. Alice clutched the back of the seat, her hands trembling. "Did we get what we needed?" she asked, her voice shaky. Rebecca nodded, her eyes locked on the road. "We got enough to bring him down. Contracts, financial records. It's all here," Victor sighed, leaning back in his seat. "Now we just have to survive long enough to use it." When they reached the safe house, Rebecca locked the doors and drew the curtains, her movements quick and deliberate. "We'll send everything to the authorities first thing in the morning," she said. "But for now, we need to lay low." Alice sat on the couch, her legs still shaking. Clara sat beside her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "We did it," Clara said softly. "We actually did it." Alice nodded, though her relief was tempered by exhaustion. The weight of the night's events pressed down on her, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. Outside, a car idled in the shadows, its headlights off. Greg sat behind the wheel, his eyes fixed on the safe house. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "They've got the evidence," he said, his voice cold. "But they won't have it for long." Would Donovan's reach destroy their final chance for justice? Or had Alice and her allies managed to stay one step ahead? The safe house was cloaked in uneasy silence, its occupants too exhausted and wary to speak much. Alice sat at the kitchen table, her head resting on her crossed arms. She hadn't slept, the adrenaline of their narrow escape still coursing through her veins. Rebecca stood by the window, peeking out from behind the curtain every few minutes. Victor was at the dining table, sorting through the documents they had taken from the warehouse. Clara dozed lightly on the couch, her face pale from the stress of the night. "This is everything," Victor said finally, holding up a thick stack of papers. "Contracts, payments, names. It's all here. If this gets to the authorities, Donovan is finished." Rebecca nodded, but her expression remained tense. "That's a big if. He won't go down without a fight. And Greg is already circling us like a vulture." Alice lifted her head, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "So, what do we do now?" Rebecca pulled out her phone and began dialing. "I'm sending everything to Detective Price. He's our best chance of making this stick. But we can't stay here. Donovan knows we're close, and he'll make his move soon." As the morning sunlight began to creep through the curtains, Rebecca finished uploading the files to the detective's secure server. She turned to the group, her tone firm. "We're leaving," she said. "Donovan has people everywhere, and we can't risk staying in one place for too long." Victor frowned. "Where can we go?" "He'll have people looking for us all over Silver Ridge." "I know a place," Rebecca said. "It's out of town, remote. We'll be safe there while Price builds the case." Alice nodded, her heart heavy. She hated the idea of running again, but she knew Rebecca was right. The group packed quickly, stuffing their few belongings into bags. Alice carefully tucked the notebook into her backpack, the weight of its contents feeling heavier than ever. Clara watched her, her brow furrowed with concern. "Do you think this will work?" Alice zipped her bag and met Clara's gaze. "It has to. It's our only chance." They piled into Rebecca's car, the air thick with tension. Rebecca drove cautiously, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. "We'll take back roads," she said. "It'll take longer, but it's safer." Victor sat in the passenger seat, studying a map. Alice and Clara were in the back, their hands gripping the seats as they watched the city fade into the distance. As they wound through the rural outskirts of Silver Ridge, Alice began to relax slightly. The dense trees and rolling hills felt like a barrier between them and Donovan's reach. But her relief was short-lived. Rebecca's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She answered it quickly, her expression darkening as she listened. "What?" she said sharply. "When?" Victor leaned closer, his brow furrowed. "What's going on?" Rebecca hung up, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "That was Detective Price. Donovan's lawyers have filed a counterclaim, arguing that the evidence was fabricated. They're demanding the investigation be dropped." Alice's stomach churned. "Can they do that?" "They can try," Rebecca said grimly. "But Price isn't backing down. He's doubling his efforts to build the case. But it's going to take time." The car fell into uneasy silence, the weight of Rebecca's words pressing down on them. Alice stared out the window, her mind racing. She thought of her father, his worried words in the journal, his desperate attempts to protect her. She thought of Magnus, locked away and awaiting his fate. And she thought of Donovan, his smug arrogance, his belief that he could control everyone around him. Alice clenched her fists. She wasn't going to let him win. They arrived at the remote safe house by late afternoon. The small cabin was tucked away in a dense forest, its exterior weathered but sturdy. Rebecca parked the car and stepped out, scanning the area carefully before motioning for the others to follow. "This place belongs to an old friend," Rebecca said as she unlocked the door. "It's off the grid, no phone lines, no internet. We'll be safe here for a while." Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy, with a single living area and 2 small bedrooms. Victor immediately set to work organizing the documents, while Rebecca checked the perimeter for any signs of unwanted visitors. Alice and Clara sat on the worn couch, their exhaustion catching up with them. "Do you think it's really over?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alice shook her head. "Not yet, but it will be." As night fell, the group settled in for what they hoped would be a quiet evening. Rebecca sat by the window, keeping watch, while Victor continued poring over the documents. Alice and Clara huddled together on the couch, their eyelids heavy. But the quiet didn't last. A sudden noise outside made Rebecca sit up straight. She motioned for everyone to stay quiet, her hand moving to the flashlight on the table. Alice's heart pounded as she strained to hear. The sound of footsteps on gravel sent a wave of fear crashing over her. "Stay here," Rebecca whispered, moving toward the door. Victor stood, his jaw tight. "I'll go with you," Rebecca nodded, and the two of them stepped outside, closing the door softly behind them. Inside, Alice and Clara huddled together, their breaths shallow. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one heavier than the last. "What's happening?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Alice said, her hands clenched tightly. The sound of raised voices outside made Alice's blood run cold. She recognized one of them immediately. "Greg." "They found us," Alice whispered, her voice barely audible. Would they escape Donovan's men once again, or had their fight finally caught up to them? The cold night air cut through the dense forest surrounding the cabin, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of Greg's voice. Alice's heart raced as she pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear. Clara clung to her side, trembling with fear. Outside, Rebecca and Victor stood firm, their silhouettes illuminated by the beam of Greg's flashlight. Behind him, two of Donovan's men flanked the path leading to the cabin, their hands hovering near their holsters. "You've gone too far this time, Rebecca," Greg said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Breaking into Donovan's warehouse? Stealing private documents? That's a bold move, even for you." Rebecca's voice was cold and steady. "Exposing the truth isn't a crime, Greg. What you and Donovan are doing, that's the real crime." Greg chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "Let's not pretend you have any leverage here. Hand over the documents, and maybe Donovan will consider being merciful." Victor stepped forward, his expression hard. "Mercy? That's rich. Coming from someone who's spent his career destroying lives for a paycheck." Greg's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. "You've made your choice, Victor. I hope it's worth it." Inside the cabin, Alice's mind raced. She couldn't sit by and do nothing while Greg and Donovan's men cornered Rebecca and Victor. "We have to help them," she whispered to Clara, her voice urgent. Clara's eyes widened. "What can we do? They have guns." Alice glanced around the room, her gaze falling on the notebook and the few remaining pages of her father's journal. Her father had faced Donovan's threats to protect her. Now it was her turn to fight. "Stay here," Alice said, her voice trembling but resolute. Clara grabbed her arm. "Alice, no." But Alice was already moving, clutching the notebook tightly as she slipped out the back door. Outside, the standoff had escalated. Greg stepped closer, his flashlight's beam sweeping across Rebecca's face. "You've been a thorn in Donovan's side for far too long," he said. "Time to cut you loose." Rebecca didn't flinch. "If you think I'm handing anything over, you're even more delusional than I thought." Greg motioned to one of the men behind him. "Search the cabin." Alice froze as the man began moving toward the front door. If he got inside, Clara would be exposed. She had to act. Clutching the notebook tightly, Alice stepped out from the shadows. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice echoing in the still night. All heads turned toward her, and for a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Greg's eyes narrowed as he spotted her. Well, look who's decided to join us." Alice stepped closer, her legs trembling but her grip on the notebook firm. "You want the documents? Then take them. But you leave Rebecca, Victor, and Clara alone." Rebecca's eyes widened. "Alice, no." Victor tried to move toward her, but one of Donovan's men raised his hand, stopping him in his tracks. Greg's smirk returned as he took a step toward Alice. "Brave, aren't you?" Too bad bravery doesn't mean much in the real world. Alice held her ground. You don't scare me, Greg. You're just a puppet for Donovan. Without him, you're nothing. Greg's face darkened, his smirk replaced by a cold glare. Careful, kid. You're starting to sound like your father. The mention of her father sent a surge of anger through Alice. She held the notebook higher, her voice steady. You'll never win. No matter what you do, the truth is already out. Donovan's going down, and so are you. The tension was palpable as Greg stopped just a few feet away from Alice. He extended his hand, his eyes gleaming with triumph. Hand it over, he demanded. Alice hesitated, her grip tightening on the notebook. She could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, Rebecca, Victor, Clara, and even the men who worked for Donovan. But she wasn't about to give up without a fight. Instead of handing Greg the notebook, Alice flung it into the air, the pages scattering like leaves in the wind. Oops, she said defiantly. Greg's face contorted with rage as he lunged forward, but Alice was faster. She darted back into the shadows, her small frame disappearing into the darkness. Chaos erupted as Rebecca and Victor took advantage of the distraction. Rebecca disarmed one of the men, while Victor tackled the other, knocking him to the ground. Greg shouted orders, but his men were too disoriented to respond. Alice ran through the forest, her heart pounding as she weaved between the trees. She could hear Greg cursing behind her, his heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. She clutched one of the scattered pages of the notebook tightly in her hand. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her resolve strong. You can run, Alice, Greg shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. But you can't hide forever. Back at the cabin, Rebecca and Victor had subdued the two guards, tying them with rope they found in the shed. Clara peeked out from the back door, her eyes wide with fear. Where's Alice? She asked, her voice trembling. Rebecca's face was grim. She ran into the forest. We have to find her. Victor grabbed a flashlight, his jaw set. Let's go. Alice's lungs burned as she sprinted through the forest, the shadows twisting around her like phantoms. She could hear Greg's footsteps gaining on her, his curses growing louder. She stumbled over a root, falling hard onto the forest floor. Pain shot through her knees, but she forced herself to stand, clutching the page tightly. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Greg shouted, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Alice's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. Ahead, she spotted a narrow gap between two large rocks. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She squeezed through the gap, her small size allowing her to slip into the hidden hollow. She pressed herself against the cool stone, holding her breath as Greg's flashlight swept past. Greg cursed loudly, kicking at the ground. You can't hide forever, Alice. You're just delaying the inevitable. His voice faded as he moved deeper into the forest, his frustration palpable. Alice remained in the hollow, her chest heaving as she tried to calm her racing heart. She knew she couldn't stay there forever, but for now she was safe. Would Alice find her way back to the cabin, or had she pushed Greg too far? The night deepened, and the forest seemed alive with every creak of branches and rustle of leaves. Alice stayed pressed against the cold rock in the hollow, her breath shallow and her ears straining for any sound of Greg. The page from the notebook crinkled in her hand, a reminder of everything she was fighting for. She knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, Greg would double back. She had to move. Clutching the page tightly, Alice peeked out from the hollow. The forest was dark, the shadows deep and impenetrable. She saw no sign of Greg, but the air still felt heavy with his presence. Back at the cabin, Rebecca paced the living room, her anxiety mounting with each passing minute. Victor stood by the door, his flashlight in hand. Clara sat on the couch, her arms wrapped around her knees. We can't wait any longer, Victor said finally. If Greg finds her, he won't, Rebecca interrupted, her voice sharp. Alice is smart. She knows how to stay ahead of him. Clara looked up, her eyes filled with tears. But what if she's hurt? What if she needs us? Rebecca hesitated, her jaw tightening. We'll find her. Stay here, Clara. Lock the door and don't open it for anyone except us. Clara nodded, her face pale. Victor opened the door, stepping into the cold night. Let's go. Alice moved cautiously through the forest, her feet barely making a sound on the leaf-strewn ground. Every step felt like a gamble, every shadow a potential threat. She glanced over her shoulder constantly, half expecting to see Greg's flashlight slicing through the darkness. She didn't know exactly where she was going, but she knew she needed to get back to the cabin. Rebecca and Victor would be looking for her, and Clara was still there, waiting. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps behind her. Alice froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She pressed herself against a tree, holding her breath as the footsteps grew louder. Greg's voice cut through the silence, low and venomous. You think you're clever, Alice? You think you can outsmart me? Alice's grip tightened on the notebook page, her pulse racing. She had to keep moving. She waited until Greg's flashlight beam swept past her hiding spot, then darted silently into the deeper shadows of the forest. Rebecca and Victor moved quickly through the woods, their flashlights casting long beams of light that illuminated the underbrush. The cold air bit at their faces, but they pressed on, their determination unwavering. She can't be far, Victor said. Greg isn't subtle. She would have heard him coming. Rebecca nodded, her jaw set. Let's just hope we get to her first. Alice's legs burned as she pushed through the dense forest, her breath coming in short gasps. She could hear Greg behind her, his frustration mounting with every step. You're only making this harder for yourself, he shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. Alice ignored him, her focus locked on the faint outline of a trail ahead. If she could just reach it, she might have a chance of finding her way back to the cabin. She burst onto the trail, her heart leaping with hope, only to freeze as Greg stepped onto it a few yards away. There you are, he said, his smirk visible even in the dim light. Alice backed away, her hands trembling. Stay away from me. Greg took a step closer, his tone mocking. What's the matter, Alice? You've been so brave up until now. Alice's mind raced. She needed to stall him, to buy time for Rebecca and Victor to find her. You're not going to win, she said, her voice shaking but defiant. The truth is already out there. Everyone knows what Donovan is. Greg's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. You're a smart kid, I'll give you that. But you don't understand how the world works. People like Donovan don't lose. They just find new ways to win. Alice took another step back, her grip tightening on the notebook page. Not this time. Before Greg could move closer, the sound of footsteps broke through the tension. A flashlight beam swept across the trail, and Rebecca's voice rang out. Alice! Alice's heart soared with relief as Rebecca and Victor appeared, their expressions fierce. Greg's smirk vanished, replaced by a sneer. You just don't know when to quit, do you, Rebecca? Rebecca stepped forward, her stance unyielding. It's over, Greg. The evidence is with the police. Donovan's empire is crumbling, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Greg's eyes narrowed, his hand twitching toward his side. Don't, Victor warned, his voice deadly. Greg hesitated, his gaze shifting between Rebecca and Victor. For a moment, the tension was suffocating. Then, with a growl of frustration, Greg turned and disappeared into the darkness. Rebecca rushed to Alice, kneeling beside her. Are you okay? Alice nodded, though her body trembled with the adrenaline of the chase. I'm okay. I didn't let him get anything. Rebecca pulled her into a tight hug, her voice filled with relief. You did good, Alice. You're safe now. Victor placed a reassuring hand on Alice's shoulder. Let's get back to the cabin. It's not safe out here. As they made their way back, the forest seemed less menacing with Rebecca and Victor by her side. Alice clutched the notebook page tightly, her resolve stronger than ever. When they reached the cabin, Clara ran out to meet them, her face lighting up with relief when she saw Alice. I was so worried, Clara said, throwing her arms around Alice. I'm okay, Alice said, her voice soft. We're all okay. Inside the cabin, Rebecca locked the door and pulled the curtains tight. Greg won't give up, she said. We need to be ready for whatever comes next. Alice nodded, her gaze steady. We will be. Would Donovan's final play bring their fight to a devastating end? Or would justice finally prevail? The air inside the cabin was heavy with anticipation. Morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows on the walls. Rebecca sat at the table, her laptop open as she reviewed the final documents they had sent to Detective Price. Victor paced the room, his brow furrowed, while Clara and Alice huddled together on the couch. We've done everything we can, Rebecca said finally, breaking the tense silence. Now it's up to the authorities to take Donovan down. Victor stopped pacing, his jaw set. And if they don't? Rebecca met his gaze, her expression unwavering. Then we'll keep fighting. Hours passed as the group waited for news. Alice felt the weight of the notebook in her lap, her fingers tracing the edges of the pages. The words her father had written echoed in her mind, a reminder of everything they had endured to get here. I hope he knows, Alice whispered, her voice trembling. Clara glanced at her. Knows what? That we didn't give up, Alice said. That we're doing this for him. The sound of Rebecca's phone buzzing shattered the quiet. She grabbed it quickly, her eyes narrowing as she read the caller ID. It's Price, she said, answering the call. What's the update? Everyone in the room held their breath as Rebecca listened intently. Her expression shifted from tense to relieved, and when she finally spoke, her voice was filled with determination. They're moving in on Donovan, Rebecca said, hanging up. The evidence we gave them was enough to get a warrant. They're raiding his offices and his house as we speak. Alice's heart leapt with hope. Do you think they'll get him? Rebecca nodded. If he's smart, he'll cooperate. If not, well. The net is closing around him. The minutes felt like hours as they waited for further news. Every sound outside the cabin made Alice jump, her nerves frayed from the constant tension. Finally, Rebecca's phone buzzed again. She answered it quickly, her hand tightening around the device as she listened. They got him, she said, her voice steady. Donovan's in custody. The room erupted into a mix of relief and disbelief. Clara hugged Alice tightly, tears streaming down her face. Victor sank into a chair, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. Rebecca smiled, though her expression remained guarded. This is a big step, but it's not the end. Donovan's lawyers will fight tooth and nail to get him out. We need to be ready. Over the next few days, news of Donovan's arrest spread like wildfire. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, eager for updates on the high-profile case. The videos of Magnus, the contracts, and Victor's testimony painted a damning picture of Donovan's empire of corruption. Alice watched the coverage from the safety of the cabin, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and sorrow. She thought of her father, his sacrifices, and the hope that he might finally be able to return. One afternoon, as the group gathered around the small TV, a knock at the door startled them. Rebecca motioned for everyone to stay back as she cautiously opened it. A man stood on the porch, his face gaunt but familiar. "Dad?" Alice whispered, her voice breaking. Nathan stepped inside, his eyes filled with tears as he opened his arms. Alice ran to him, burying her face in his chest as sobs racked her body. "I'm so sorry, Alice," Nathan said, his voice trembling. "I never wanted to leave you. I thought it was the only way to keep you safe." Alice clung to him, her heart overflowing with relief and pain. "You came back. That's all that matters." The reunion was bittersweet, as Nathan explained the depths of Donovan's threats and the fear that had driven him away. But his return marked a turning point, a chance for their family to begin healing. Rebecca and Victor watched from the sidelines, their expressions filled with quiet satisfaction. They had fought for this moment, and it was a victory they would carry with them forever. In the weeks that followed, Magnus was released from captivity and transferred to a wildlife sanctuary. The lion's story captivated the nation, and his roar became a symbol of resilience and justice. Alice visited Magnus before he was transported, her hand resting gently on the bars of his enclosure. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving me." Magnus rumbled softly, his golden eyes meeting hers. It felt like a goodbye, but also a promise. a reminder that courage could change the world. The trial against Donovan was long and grueling, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. He was sentenced to decades in prison, his empire dismantled piece by piece. Alice stood outside the courthouse on the day of the verdict, her father by her side. Rebecca and Victor were there too, their faces filled with quiet pride. As the crowd dispersed, Alice turned to Rebecca. "What happens now?" Rebecca smiled, placing a hand on Alice's shoulder. "Now we move forward, one step at a time." Months later, Alice stood on the edge of a vast wildlife reserve, her eyes scanning the horizon. Magnus roamed freely in the distance, his golden mane shining in the sunlight. "I'll never forget you," Alice said softly. She felt her father's hand on her shoulder, a comforting weight. Together, they watched as Magnus disappeared into the wilderness, a symbol of freedom and hope. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer defined Alice's story. She had faced unimaginable challenges, but she had emerged stronger, braver, and more determined than ever to protect the truth. And as the sun set over the reserve, Alice knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with possibility, resilience, and the unyielding strength of the human spirit.